The day Grant Langston rode into Millhaven, New Mexico territory, the dust rose behind him like something biblical, like the land itself was trying to warn the town about what was coming. It was the autumn of 1882, and Millhaven was the kind of settlement that existed only because the railroad had made a promise it had not yet kept. 300 souls clung to the place with the quiet desperation of people who had nowhere better to go, or who had already burned their better places down and could not go back. There was one main street, a dry goods store that doubled as a post office, a saloon with a cracked mirror behind the bar, a livery stable that smelled of ammonia and old straw, and a church whose congregation had dwindled since the reverend's wife ran off with a cattle buyer from Santa Fe. There was also a small boarding house at the far end of the street, a two-story structure the color of old cream, run by a widow named Mrs. Clara Prout, who charged fair rates and asked no questions so long as her guests were quiet after 9 in the evening. Grant Langston was 34 years old and had not been quiet after 9 in the evening for most of his adult life. He was a man built from hard years and harder choices, broad across the shoulders in the way of someone who had always worked with his hands, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of a storm-troubled sky, gray with the occasional flicker of something that might have been blue if the light was right, and the man was in a different mood. He wore a duster that had once been the color of tobacco and was now just the color of everything the road had thrown at it, and he carried a Colt revolver on his right hip with the easy familiarity of a man for whom the weapon was simply part of his anatomy. He had not always been this way. There had been a time, before the war with the Comanche raiders cost him his ranch, before the long years of drifting from one cattle drive to the next, before a business arrangement with a man named Cyrus Callow had gone badly and ended with Grant walking away from a burning freight depot and 2 dead men on the ground behind him, when he had been capable of softness, when he had said please and thank you and meant the words, when he had sat on a porch in the evening and listened to the crickets and felt like the world had some goodness waiting for him in it. That was 10 years gone. A whole decade of silences and distances and doing what needed doing without ceremony or courtesy. He did not ask. He stated or he took or he did without. Please was a word that had simply stopped living in him, the way certain birds stopped living in a country after the trees they nested in were cut down. The habitat was gone, and so the creature was gone with it. He rode into Millhaven because he had a job, simple enough. A rancher named Theodore Holt needed a man to manage his cattle operation for the winter season, which meant overseeing the hands, tracking the herd through the cold months, and ensuring the cattle made it to market in the spring without being picked off by rustlers or driven into ravines by the kind of early blizzards that descended on the New Mexico high country without apology. It paid $40 a month plus board, and Grant had taken work for less. He stabled his horse, a dark bay gelding he called Cedar for no reason he had ever explained to anyone, and walked to the boarding house because Theodore Holt's ranch was 2 miles outside town, and he intended to sleep in a real bed before he rode out to meet his new employer in the morning. Mrs. Clara Prout gave him a room on the 2nd floor with a window that looked out over the dry goods store, took his money, and reminded him that it was quiet after 9. He agreed without agreeing. He set his saddlebags down on the narrow bed and looked at the walls of the room for a moment, the faded wallpaper printed with small cornflowers that had once been blue and were now nearly colorless, and he felt the particular species of loneliness that only comes to people who have been alone so long they have stopped expecting company. It was not painful exactly. It was more like a weather condition you simply lived inside of, the way you lived inside of cold or heat. You put on what you had and you kept moving. He was down at the basin in the corner, washing the road off his face, when he heard the voice. It came from downstairs, clear and unhurried, the kind of voice that does not try to fill a room but does anyway, simply because it is precise and genuine, and carries within it the sense that the person speaking is paying complete attention to the world. "Mrs. Prout, I wonder if I might borrow your good scissors again. I have a hem that has given up entirely on being a hem." Mrs. Prout's voice answered, lower and more amused than Grant had expected from the landlady who had greeted him with such severity. "Third drawer on the left in the kitchen, Miss Abbott, and do try to bring them back before I need to cut the bread cloth in the morning. I will have them back before supper." "Thank you kindly." There was the sound of feet on the stairs, light and purposeful, and then a door closing somewhere down the hall from Grant's room, and then silence. He did not think about it. He dried his face on the rough cotton towel and lay down on the bed in his clothes and was asleep in minutes, because 10 years of hard living had taught him to sleep when sleeping was available. In the morning he came down early, when the light was still new, and the whole town was just beginning its negotiations with the day, and he found the dining table in Mrs. Prout's front room occupied by a woman sitting alone with a cup of coffee and a piece of mending in her lap, squinting at a needle with the focused severity of someone trying to thread it in uncertain light. She was 27 or 28, he guessed, though he was not good at guessing and knew it. She had brown hair pinned up with the practical tidiness of someone who considered hair an administrative matter rather than an ornament, and a face that was not conventionally beautiful in the way of the illustrated magazines but was entirely arresting in the way of real things, of faces that have actually lived in weather and thought serious thoughts. Her eyes were hazel, he would learn later, though in that first morning light they appeared simply dark and very alert. She was wearing a calico dress the color of sage, simple and well-made, and she had the bearing of someone who had been taught good posture and had kept it not from vanity but because it genuinely helped her get through the day. She looked up when he came in, registered his presence without alarm or excessive interest, and returned to the needle. "Coffee is on the stove," she said without looking up again. "Mrs. Prout goes to the market Tuesdays. She leaves it made." Grant crossed to the kitchen, found the coffee pot, poured himself a cup and came back to the table. He sat across from her because there was no other chair in proximity to the stove's warmth, which was modest but better than nothing in the early morning chill of October. She had threaded the needle and was now making small, exact stitches along what appeared to be the hem of a curtain panel. "You ride in yesterday?" she asked, still without looking up. "Yes. Thought I heard a horse at the stable around 4. Theodore Holt's operation, I'd guess, given the time of year." "He always hires a new man for the winter." Grant looked at her. "You know Holt." "Everybody knows everybody in Millhaven," she said, with a tone that was not quite resignation and not quite humor but something that lived comfortably between the two. "It's a condition of the place. My name is Edith Abbott. I teach school here, which means I know everyone and their children's worst habits in extraordinary detail. Grant Langston." She looked up then, briefly, a clean, appraising look that was the opposite of coy. "You planning to stay the winter?" "Until spring." "Then you'll be needing to know where things are and how things work," she said, returning to her stitching. "The barber shop opens Mondays and Thursdays. Doc Whitmore is on the south end of Elm, which is the street behind this one. The saloon is run by a man named Pete Galveston who is mostly honest. The mercantile is Harlow's, and old Harlow will try to add 10 cents to anything if he thinks you're a stranger, so go in there knowing your prices." Grant drank his coffee and listened to this inventory of the town being delivered with the same calm efficiency she was applying to the hem, and he felt, not warmth exactly, but the absence of the usual coldness. She was not trying to charm him. She was simply being useful, the way a good map is useful. There was something unexpectedly restoring about it. "Why are you telling me all this?" he asked. She cut the thread with the scissors she had borrowed from Mrs. Prout's kitchen drawer and held the curtain hem up to inspect it. "Because you look like a man who does not ask for directions," she said, without inflection, "and it seems wasteful to let you wander around being confused when I can fix it in 3 minutes." He almost smiled. He caught it and did not let it reach his face, but it was there for a fraction of a second, a reflex that he had thought long since atrophied. He finished his coffee, set the cup on the table, and stood to go. He had a ranch to get to and an employer to meet, but he paused at the door, for a reason he could not have articulated if pressed. "Thank you," he said, "for the information." She was already folding the curtain panel. "You're welcome, Mr. Langston. Good luck with Holt's cattle." He rode out to the Holt ranch with Cedar moving easily through the cold morning air, and he told himself the courtesy he had just extended meant nothing. It was simply the minimal social maintenance required to live alongside other human beings. It had nothing to do with the woman in the sage-colored dress, who mended curtains before breakfast, and catalogued a whole town's useful information with the dispassionate clarity of someone who had decided long ago that the best thing she could do with her intelligence was make it available to people who needed it. Theodore Holt was a weathered man of 55 with a white mustache, and the deliberate movements of someone whose joints had been renegotiating terms with him for years. He showed Grant around the operation with a frankness Grant appreciated, laying out exactly what the problems were and where the solutions had been failing. He had 4 hands, including 2 young brothers named Dennis and Archie Prater, who were capable workers but prone to distraction, a quiet Navajo man named Raymond who had worked the ranch for 7 years and knew the land better than anyone, and an older hand named Burl Cassidy, who was no relation to anyone famous and was quick to tell you so. The cattle were spread across 3 pastures with the winter fence lines needing repair in 2 places. There had been rustling activity to the north, attributed to a loose group of opportunistic riders who moved through the territory without fixed base, not organized enough to be a gang, but troublesome enough to have cost Holt 12 head in September. The barn needed a new section of roof before the first serious snow came down. Grant assessed all of it with the precise attention of a man who had done exactly this kind of work in exactly this kind of territory before, and understood its rhythms as well as he understood his own breathing. "I'll need lumber for the roof and wire for the north fence before the end of the week," he told Holt. "And the 2 Prater boys need supervision on the line riding, or they'll miss the places the rustlers are likely to be watching." Holt looked at him with the particular relief of a man whose burdens have just been acknowledged by someone competent. "You think you know where they come in?" "Not yet." "I'll ride the perimeter this afternoon and I'll know by evening." Holt nodded. "I'll have the lumber order into Harlow's by noon." Grant rode the perimeter that afternoon and found what he expected to find. The north fence had been cut and rehung 3 times in the same spot, which meant the rustlers were using the same entry point repeatedly, because it was the most sheltered approach. A dry creek bed that curved close to the fence line and gave a rider coming from the north enough cover to approach without being visible from the main pasture. He made notes and rode back to report to Holt, and then he rode the 2 miles back to Millhaven because it was Tuesday, and he had been eating cold beef from a tin for the last 3 days, and Mrs. Prout did a proper supper on weeknights for her boarders. Edith Abbott was at the supper table, along with Mrs. Prout and an elderly gentleman named Mr. Foss, who was a retired land surveyor, and ate everything with the solemn gratitude of someone who knows that each good meal is a small miracle not to be taken for granted. The conversation was the ordinary commerce of a small town's evening, the news from the telegraph office which Edith had stopped by on the way home from school, a discussion of the weather which Mr. Foss had opinions on based on the behavior of his arthritic knee, and Mrs. Prout's account of the market's inadequate supply of decent apples this season. Grant ate and listened, and did not contribute much because he was not in the habit of contributing much to dinner-table conversations. But he listened to Edith's account of her school day with the particular quality of attention he gave to things he wanted to understand. She taught 14 children ranging in age from 6 to 13, in a single room that had been a feed storage building, before the town acquired enough children to warrant an educational enterprise. She was describing a dispute between two of the older boys over a geography disagreement, whether the Mississippi River was the longest or the widest river in the nation, and the way she described resolving it, by producing an atlas and reading from it aloud so that both boys could feel they had received information from an authoritative source rather than from each other, which would have been intolerable to both their dignities, made Grant set down his fork for a moment. "That is a reasonable solution," he said. Everyone at the table looked at him because it was the most he had said in 2 evenings of suppers. Edith glanced at him with that same clean, evaluating directness. "Thank you, Mr. Langston. Billy Crane is particularly resistant to learning anything if he suspects it might make him look ignorant, so you have to give him the information through a side door." "Sounds like managing cattle," Grant said. She tilted her head slightly. "I suppose it does. You herd them toward the right place without letting them know they're being herded." "Exactly." Mr. Foss laughed at this, a dry, warm laugh. "Miss Abbott, are you comparing the children of Millhaven to cattle?" "Only in the most affectionate sense," Edith said, and she smiled, and Grant looked at the table because the smile was the kind that did something to a room's temperature, not aggressively, not performatively, but quietly and completely. The weeks that followed fell into a pattern that Grant did not seek out but did not resist. He worked the Holt Ranch from early morning through late afternoon, overseeing the fence repairs and the roof work, and the restructuring of the line riding rotation that would cover the north approach. The work was familiar and absorbing, and he was good at it in the deep, unself-conscious way that comes from years of practice. Theodore Holt was a fair-minded employer who gave Grant the authority to make decisions, and then let him make them without second-guessing, which was the kind of management relationship Grant had always functioned best within. In the evenings he rode back to Millhaven. Mrs. Pruett's supper table became a thing he anticipated with a measured and careful emotion that he did not examine too closely. There was always something Edith was thinking about, some problem from the school or from the town or from the book she was currently reading, which she had borrowed from a small lending collection maintained by the Methodist Church's Women's Auxiliary, and she thought out loud in a way that was never presumptuous about her own correctness, always genuinely working something through. He began to contribute more. Not much, but more. He answered her questions when she seemed to be addressing them to the table at large, rather than to specific ears. He offered observations from the ranch that connected to things she'd said. Slowly, with the careful incremental quality of a process that could not be rushed, he became a participant in the evening conversations rather than an observer of them. One Thursday evening in late October, when the first real cold of the season had settled over the New Mexico high country like a second sky made of ice, Edith came to supper with a problem she was visibly working through. She had a map spread on the end of the table, a rough hand-drawn thing that showed the position of the schoolroom relative to the homes of the children, and she was tracing routes with her finger while eating, which Mrs. Pruitt bore with the resigned tolerance of someone who had learned that Edith Abbott's mind simply did not stop when the social occasion required it. "The Ray's children walk 3 miles in each direction," she said, not to anyone in particular. "In summer that's nothing. In November it's going to be a problem." "Speak to their father," Grant said. "Miguel Reyes has a wagon. He can bring them in on the cold days." Edith looked up at him. "You know Miguel Reyes? He shoes horses for Holt when the regular farrier is out. We've spoken. And you think he'd be willing? If you ask him directly, he's a practical man. He doesn't like to think his children are suffering a hardship if there's a sensible fix." Edith nodded slowly, folding the map. "That's useful to know. I appreciate that." "You're welcome." It was a small exchange. It was nothing. It was the kind of thing people say to each other 50 times a day without registering it. But Grant noticed that he meant it, the "you're welcome," that it was not reflexive politeness but something that had actual content in it, an actual feeling of gladness that the information had been useful to her. He noticed this the way you notice a crack in ice, not because it is dramatic, but because it means something about the structural conditions is changing. On a Sunday in early November, Grant rode into town to collect supplies he'd ordered from Harlow's Mercantile, and found Millhaven in a state of unusual agitation. There were horses tied at the saloon in numbers that indicated a gathering of some kind, and several of the townspeople were clustered near the sheriff's office, which was occupied by a man named Lucas Bream, who was competent enough in the ordinary management of small-town disputes, but had a documented tendency toward delay in situations requiring more decisive action. Grant pulled Cedar up and looked at the gathering and felt the particular atmospheric quality of trouble, which he had been in the presence of enough times to recognize the way other people might recognize the smell of rain. He tied Cedar and crossed to where a man named Sorensen, who owned the feed store, was standing with 3 others looking worriedly at the sheriff's door. "What's happened?" Grant asked. Sorensen looked at him with the expression of someone grateful to have someone to tell. "Riders came through last night, 3 of them. They took 6 horses from the livery stable and got into a confrontation with young Pete Galveston's stable hand. Boy's not badly hurt, but they pistol-whipped him hard enough that Doc Whitmore is keeping him through the night." Grant felt the cold settle into the familiar shape of a problem requiring action. Rustlers from the north or someone else. Nobody knows them. Not Holt's problem. They came from the East Road. "What's Bream doing?" Sorensen's expression said everything. "He sent a telegram to the territorial marshal's office." "The marshal is in Santa Fe," Grant said. "By the time anyone comes from Santa Fe, those riders are in Texas." He went to the sheriff's office and spoke with Lucas Bream for 10 minutes, and came out with the information that 2 other deputies were available, and that Bream was willing to authorize a tracking party if someone else organized it. Grant organized it. He pulled together Bream's 2 deputies, Raymond from the Holt Ranch, who was the best tracker he had worked with in 10 years, and Dennis Prater, who was young and eager and whose excess energy needed a legitimate channel. It took 2 days. The tracks went east and then circled north, and they found the riders camped in a dry canyon 20 miles from Millhaven, the stolen horses hobbled and picketed nearby. The confrontation was brief and almost entirely without violence, because when 5 organized and purposeful men approach 3 horse thieves in the gray light before dawn, the horse thieves generally make the rational calculation. All 3 were taken back to Millhaven and delivered to Sheriff Bream, the horses recovered, and the stable hand's dignity and losses somewhat compensated by the fact that the whole affair had been resolved before Sunday of the following week. Grant returned to Millhaven on the Tuesday evening, rode tired and smelling of 2 days in the saddle, and found Edith on the porch of the boarding house with a lamp and a book, the cold air seemingly not deterring her in the slightest, which he had already begun to understand was characteristic. She looked up when he came up the steps. "You're back." "Yes. I heard what you did. The whole town knows." She was not looking at him with admiration exactly, but with a kind of steady, serious attention that was more affecting than admiration. "The stable hand's mother came to the school today to tell me. She was crying a little, not the unhappy kind." Grant stood on the porch with his saddlebags over one shoulder and did not know what to do with this information or with the way she was looking at him. "It was the practical thing to do," he said. "Most practical things don't get done," Edith said, "which is why we remember the times when they do." He went inside and washed and came back down to eat the plate Mrs. Pruitt had kept warm for him, and Edith was still on the porch when he came through the dining room, and she came in and sat down across from him while he ate, not formally, not deliberately, just because the evening had arranged itself that way. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask." "Why did you leave wherever you came from?" He looked at her. The question was direct but not prying, asked with the same tone she used to present facts to her students, as though she were genuinely curious and had decided that the most efficient approach was honesty. "Bad circumstances," he said. "Yours or somebody else's?" "Both. A man I worked with made a decision that cost lives. I made choices after that I'm not proud of. Then I left. She was quiet for a moment, and he appreciated that she did not fill the quiet with sympathy or reassurance, just let it sit there in its honest dimensions. I came here from Ohio, she said, unexpectedly. I had a situation there that had stopped working in the way that situations sometimes just stop, not with one big failure but with a long, slow failing, like a seam in fabric that's been under too much tension for too long. A man I was supposed to marry decided he wanted something more conventional than a woman who preferred books to parlor society. So I took the teaching position here when I saw it advertised, and I came. That was brave, Grant said, before he could consider whether to say it. She looked at him with what he was beginning to identify as her private humor, a small contained amusement she did not broadcast. It was practical. I needed a life to live, and Ohio had stopped providing one. Practically brave, then. That is the best kind, she agreed. November deepened, and the cold came down from the mountains with the slow authority of something that had been waiting. The Holt Ranch consumed Grant's days completely. The roof repair was finished the first week of November, which was just before the first hard frost came and would have been disastrous if they had fallen behind schedule. The north fence was reinforced, and the line riding rotation covered the weak points. There had been no more rustling activity from the north, which Grant attributed partly to the new coverage and partly to a cold front that made the open country miserable enough to discourage casual criminal enterprise. He rode back to Millhaven each evening with the particular motivation of a man who has been honest enough with himself to acknowledge what he is riding toward, even if he has not spoken it aloud or examined it in the way it deserved to be examined. The evenings at Mrs. Pruitt's table had become something he relied on in the way he relied on sleep and food, as a necessary condition of functioning. Edith's conversation was a thing he had not known he was hungry for, the particular nourishment of talking to someone who thought carefully and listened completely, and was never performing for an audience, always simply being exactly herself. He began to notice the small details of her, as you only notice the details of things you look at with sustained attention. The way she held a pencil, gripped tightly with the unconscious firmness of someone who writes many things in a day. The way she tilted her head slightly when she was listening to something that interested her, as though the sound came in better from one direction. The way she never asked for help with anything she could manage herself, not out of pride, but out of the same efficient ethics she applied to everything. The conviction that you should do what you are capable of doing and save the asking for what you genuinely cannot. One evening in mid-November, she came to supper with ink on her right hand, and a preoccupied expression that she was clearly trying to set aside in deference to the social nature of the meal, but was not entirely succeeding at. When Mrs. Pruitt went to the kitchen, and Mr. Foss began one of his extended stories about a surveying expedition in Nevada, Grant said quietly to Edith, "What is it?" She glanced at him, surprised, the way people are surprised when they have thought their preoccupation was invisible. The Territorial School Board is making decisions about funding. There is a proposal to consolidate the small schools in this area, which would mean the children of Millhaven would need to travel to Prescott for schooling. Prescott is 15 miles. Grant considered this. That would not work for most of the families here. It would not work for any of them, Edith said, with a controlled precision that told him she had been holding this particular feeling very tightly in check for a while. The Ray's family, the Garner family, the three families out on the East Road, none of them have the means to board children in another town. The effect would be that the children of Millhaven simply stop being educated. You're going to fight it. She looked at him, and the private humor was there, but under it something more serious, something almost raw. I am going to write letters. I am going to write to every member of the school board and to the territorial governor if it comes to that. I know the law on this. There's a provision for community petition in the territorial education statute that requires the board to consider a formal objection from residents before any consolidation can be finalized. Do you know how to write a formal petition? I am learning rapidly. "I've filed legal documents with county boards before," Grant said. "Not school matters, range disputes, and grazing rights, but the structure is similar. The language that boards respond to." She studied him. "Would you be willing to look at what I write before I send it?" It was not a significant thing. It was a practical offer and a practical acceptance of a practical offer. But in the context of who Grant Langston was, a man who had spent 10 years being of use to no one but his employers and occasionally himself, the willingness to be useful to her was notable in the way a river changing course is notable, not in the immediate moment, but in what it means about the landscape's intentions. "Yes," he said. "Bring it to me when you have a draft." She brought him the first draft 2 days later, knocked on his door in the evening with a sheaf of pages, and the focused expression of someone delivering something they have put real work into. He read it sitting at the small desk in his room with the lamp turned up, and she sat on the chair by the window, not watching him exactly but present, and outside the window the first real snow of the season was beginning, small and deliberate flakes falling through the dark. The draft was good, better than good, in fact. She wrote with the precision of someone who thought in clear structures, and had a lawyer's instinct for identifying the exact provision she needed to invoke, and the exact language that would resonate with officials who were primarily responsive to legal obligation, rather than moral appeal. But there were 2 places where the argument's momentum stalled, where she had retreated into abstraction when specific figures would have been more powerful. He told her this directly, without softening it, because he understood instinctively that she would not want it softened. She read the parts he indicated and nodded once sharply. "You're right. The enrollment numbers and the travel distances, in concrete terms. And the economic argument. Frame it in terms of the community's tax contributions relative to the services received. Board members respond to fiscal framing. Because it removes the personal element. Because it removes the emotional element from their decision and replaces it with a technical one. You're not asking them to care about the children. You're telling them they're obligated by statute and financial logic." She looked up from the pages at him, and the look was different from the others, less evaluating and more searching, as though she were trying to understand something about him that went beyond the words they were exchanging. "Where did you learn all this?" she asked. "Hard years," he said, which was what he always said, and then, because it was her and she was looking at him that way, he added, "I ran a freight operation for 2 years in Kansas. Had to fight 3 different county boards for operating licenses. You learn to speak their language." "What happened to the freight operation?" The silence before he answered was a short one, but she heard it and waited. "The man I mentioned. Bad choices were made. The operation burned." She did not ask for more. She received this information with the same respectful acceptance she had given his earlier silence, and he was grateful for it in a way that pressed against his chest from the inside. "I'll revise tonight," she said, gathering the pages. "Thank you, Mr. Langston, genuinely." "Grant," he said. She paused. "I beg your pardon. My name is Grant, Mr. Langston is what I'm called when something official is happening." Something shifted in her expression, subtle as a current in deep water, and she almost smiled. "Grant," she said, as though she were trying the word's weight. "Then you must call me Edith, since we are apparently collaborating on official documents." He agreed that he would. She revised and he reviewed, and she sent the petition on a Thursday, and he watched her walk to the post office with the sealed envelope and noticed the set of her shoulders, the straightness and the slight tension in them that was not rigidity but readiness, the posture of someone who has done everything within their power and is now delivering the matter to the unreliable custody of the world, and he thought that was one of the bravest things he had seen. The willingness to put your best effort into something and send it forward without any guarantee of what it would meet. The weeks that followed were the fullest Grant had lived in years. The ranch work was demanding, and he gave it everything it required, but the evenings were different now, were something more than recovery from the day's labor. He and Edith had developed a habit of taking a brief walk after supper on the nights when the weather permitted it, which in November in New Mexico was not many nights, but was enough nights to make the habit feel real. The streets of Millhaven after supper were mostly empty, the cold keeping people indoors, and the walk was simply two people moving through cold air and talking. She told him about Ohio, about the town she had grown up in, respectable and suffocating in equal measure, full of the particular provincial certainty that the correct way to be a woman was specific and narrow, and if you did not fit within it, you were failing at something fundamental about your own nature. She had been a curious girl who loved books and maps and the way numbers described the world, and she had been told repeatedly that these appetites were unfeminine, not cruelly but with the weary patience of people who genuinely believed they were helping her. "The man," Grant said one evening, "the one who wanted something more conventional." "Robert Ellison," she said, with the tone of someone reporting on a historical figure. "He was not a bad man. He simply wanted a wife who would make his social life easier, and I was not that. I kept asking difficult questions at dinner parties and embarrassing him with opinions. The problem was his, not yours. I know that now," she said. "At 22 I thought I was broken. By 25 I had worked out that the fitting was wrong, not the person." He told her things, too. Not everything, but things. He told her about his parents' farm in Missouri and the particular green light of Missouri summer mornings, when the air was thick with humidity and the whole world smelled of growth and possibility. He told her about the Comanche raid that destroyed his first ranch, not because he sought her sympathy, but because she had asked him once where he had been before Kansas, and the answer required this information. He told it plainly, the facts of the matter without ornament, the cattle lost and the buildings burned and his foreman killed, and she listened with the quality of attention that made information feel received and held rather than simply heard. He did not tell her about the two men who had died at the freight depot. Not yet. Not because he was hiding it exactly, but because the story required more context than he knew how to give it, and the context required a degree of trust that was still, in November, a few weeks from being fully established. December arrived, and with it two important developments. The first was that the Territorial School Board sent a response to Edith's petition, not immediately and not with enthusiasm, but a response that acknowledged the petition's statutory standing and indicated that a hearing would be scheduled before any final consolidation decision, which meant that the children of Millhaven had, at minimum, a formal opportunity to be heard. Edith received this letter at breakfast and read it twice and set it down and was very quiet for a moment in the particular way of someone containing a feeling too large for immediate expression. Then she looked at Grant and said, "We bought them time." "You bought them time," he said. "I only helped with the language." "The language was the important part," she said. "I had the argument. You showed me how to make the argument matter to the right people." He looked at her, and the warmth in his chest was real and undeniable, and he was done pretending it was something else. The second development came the following week. Grant was riding the south pasture fence line on a gray Wednesday afternoon when he heard shooting. It was not close, half a mile to the east at least, but the pattern of it was wrong, not hunting, not practice, something else. He rode toward it with the careful urgency of a man who is fast because he is competent but not reckless, and found Dennis Prater on foot with his horse lame and 3 riders he did not recognize coming at him from the direction of the creek bed at a hard canter. Grant put Cedar between Dennis and the riders and held up his hand, and called out in the flat carrying voice he had learned was more effective than a shout for conveying authority. "That's far enough." The riders pulled up. The one in the lead was a heavy man on a gray horse, with the wary, calculating expression of someone who had been turned back before, and was assessing whether this situation was worth the effort. "The boy was on our range," the man said. "This is Theodore Holt's range and you're 3 miles inside it," Grant said. "The boundary markers are the cottonwood stakes which you passed at the creek. You know where you are." The calculation in the man's eyes tipped and resolved. He was not interested in a fight he had not planned for, and Grant's posture communicated clearly that a fight was what a pursuit would produce. They turned and rode back toward the creek. Dennis Prater was shaking slightly when Grant dismounted to look at the horse's leg. Not badly. It was a stone bruise and would heal with rest, but the young man's face was pale. "Thank you," Dennis said, with the trembling dignity of someone who is trying not to show how frightened he has been. "I didn't know what they wanted." "They were testing the boundary," Grant said, running his hand along the horse's near foreleg, "seeing if anyone was watching. They know now." He reported the incident to Holt that evening and recommended sending word to the neighboring ranch, a spread owned by a man named Calder, to establish whether the 3 riders were connected to any ongoing dispute in the area. Holt agreed and sent Raymond with a message. The riders were not seen again. But coming back from the Holt ranch that evening, riding through the cold that had become familiar and almost companionable over the weeks, Grant thought about the moment he had put cedar between Dennis Prater and those riders without hesitation. It was not heroism. It was simply the correct thing, the protective instinct operating at a level below conscious decision. But he noticed that the feeling it produced afterward was not the flat functional satisfaction of a task completed, but something more alive than that, something that connected to the broader context of being in Millhaven, of having people around him whose safety and well-being had begun to matter to him. One person in particular. He arrived at the boarding house and found Edith in the sitting room with 2 of her students' families, the Rays couple, and a woman named Harriet Garner, whose husband worked at the mine outside town. They were discussing preparations for the school's Christmas program, a tradition Edith maintained with the same organizational rigor she applied to everything, and she was taking notes on a small pad with the ink-stained pen she used for everything. She looked up when he came in, and the look was the particular one she had begun to give him in the last few weeks, a look that acknowledged him specifically, not just registered his presence but recognized it, and there was warmth in it that had moved well past the territory of polite regard. He nodded to the assembled families, excused himself to change out of his work clothes, and came back down to find that Mrs. Prout had kept supper warm and Edith had stayed after the families left to help clear the sitting room of the paper and fabric samples they had spread across the table in their planning. They ate alone that night, Mrs. Prout having retired early with a headache, and Mr. Foss, who had been invited to his nephew's house for the week. The quiet of the dining room with the lamp burning and the snow beginning outside was a particular quality of quiet that Grant had not experienced in many years, not silence, not emptiness, but the comfortable inhabited quietness of 2 people who have stopped needing to fill space with words because the space is already full enough. "Dennis Prater's mother told me what happened today," Edith said, over the last of the coffee. "Word travels fast here. Always," she said. "Are you all right?" He looked at her. She was asking with the directness that was simply who she was, not dramatizing it, not making it into more than it was, just asking the clean, simple question. "Yes," he said. "Those men, will they come back?" "I don't think so. They were opportunistic, not committed. A clear boundary was enough." She nodded and was quiet for a moment, and then she said, with the careful precision of someone saying something they have been considering for a while, "I'm glad you're here, Grant. In Millhaven. I think this town needed someone like you, and did not know it." The air in the room changed in the small, subtle way that air changes when the thing that has been hovering finally touches ground. He looked at her and she looked back at him, and neither of them looked away, and what was in his chest was large and warm and completely real, and had been building for 6 weeks with the patient accumulation of water behind a dam that was finally going to have to decide whether it was a dam or a river. "Edith," he said, and stopped, because what he wanted to say required more courage than facing 3 riders in a cold pasture, and he was not yet certain he had it. She waited. She was very good at waiting. "I have not been," he said slowly, "a man who has much business being in anyone's company, For a long time. I have done the work and kept the distance, and that was the whole of it." She was still watching him with that absolute quality of attention, the listening that received everything. "Something has changed," he said. "Being here, talking with you. It has changed something that I thought was too far gone to change." She set down her coffee cup with the careful deliberateness of someone who wants their hands to be still and steady. "Something has changed for me as well," she said quietly. "I think you know that. I thought I might. I wanted to be sure I was not imagining it." "You are not imagining it." They sat with this truth between them for a long moment, and it was not an uncomfortable moment. It was in fact the opposite of uncomfortable. It was the first truly comfortable moment Grant Langston had experienced in something close to 10 years. The feeling of being exactly where you were meant to be in exactly the company you were meant to be in. "I don't know how to do this gracefully," he said. "I have spent a long time being a person who keeps everything at a distance. I may be awkward at the parts that require closeness." "I am a schoolteacher," Edith said, and the private humor was there in full warmth now. "I am professionally accustomed to patience with people who are learning new things." He almost laughed, a real almost laugh that he felt in his whole body, and she smiled at him, the full smile, the room temperature one, and he thought she was the most remarkable thing he had encountered in the entirety of his life. He reached across the table slowly, telegraphing the movement the way you telegraph slow approach to a frightened animal, not because she was frightened but because he was, and took her hand where it rested beside the coffee cup. She turned her hand over and clasped his, steady and warm, and did not look away. They stayed that way for a long time, in the lamplit quiet of the dining room with the snow falling outside, and Grant Langston felt the decades-old architecture of his isolation beginning, very slowly, to come apart at its joints. The Christmas program at the school was the talk of Millhaven for the entire week leading up to it, which was the last week of December 1882, and when the night arrived the small schoolroom was packed with every family in town and several from the surrounding ranches, the children performing readings and songs, and a short dramatization of a historical event that Edith had written herself. A scene from the Lewis and Clark expedition that she had chosen specifically, because it required both boys and girls in interesting roles, and did not confine anyone to simply standing at the side looking decorative. Grant sat near the back with Theodore Holt and his wife, a small, energetic woman named Me who had decided within approximately 4 minutes of meeting Grant that he was a good man, and treated him accordingly, which was the only basis on which Me Holt ever treated anyone. He watched Edith moving between the students with the quiet authority and affection of someone who has found the exact right work for their exact right nature, guiding and encouraging and redirecting with a touch on the shoulder here, a whispered word there, and the children responded to her with the complete trust of young creatures in the presence of a person who genuinely wants them to flourish. Something in him was so full it was almost painful, in the way that returning circulation to a part of yourself that has been numb for a long time is almost painful. The sensation of feeling returning. After the program, when the families had gone and the children had been collected, and the room was cleared, Grant helped Edith carry the decorations to the storage cabinet and fold the curtain backdrop that 2 of the older students had painted. The night was deeply cold, and the stars over Millhaven were extraordinary, the kind of stars that exist only in clear cold air far from anything larger than a small town, extravagant in their number and their brightness. They walked back toward the boarding house through this starred dark, and Grant had been thinking for several days about something he needed to say to her, something that required honesty of the most uncomfortable kind, the kind that involves laying down the last of the protection you have been carrying. "I need to tell you something," he said as they walked. "All right," she said. "About the freight depot, about the 2 men who died." She said nothing, only walked beside him with attention like a steady light. He told her. He told her the whole of it, the way it had actually happened. that the business arrangement with Cyrus Callow had involved moving goods that Grant had eventually understood were not entirely legitimate, not weapons or anything so dramatic, but stolen property, and that when he had confronted Callow about it, Callow had produced two men of the kind who were employed for their willingness to do things other men would not. That there had been a fight, not a planned one but the real uncontrolled kind, and that Grant had survived it and the two men had not, and that the fire afterward had been Callow's attempt to erase the evidence of everything. He told her that he had testified to the marshal, and that the marshal had determined it was self-defense and closed the case, and that Callow had fled the territory and had not been found. He told her that the freight operation had been lost in the fire, along with everything he had built in those 2 years. He told her that he had left because staying had felt impossible, that the knowledge of what had happened and the way it had happened was a thing he could not remain in the vicinity of while trying to rebuild anything. He told her all of this, and then he was quiet and waited. Edith walked for a few paces in silence. The cold air moved around them. Somewhere down the street the saloon made its distant warm noise. That must have been a terrible thing to carry alone, she said. He had not expected that to be the first thing she said. He had expected, not condemnation exactly, but caution, the natural protective withdrawal of a careful person when presented with a complicated history. "It has been," he said. "You did not go looking for it. The man deceived you and then tried to kill you. I made the choice to be in business with him. That part belongs to me." "Yes," she said, with measured honesty that he respected enormously. "It does, and you have been accountable to it for 10 years clearly." She paused. "Do you believe you are still that person, the one who made that choice?" He thought about it genuinely, the way she asked things that demanded genuine thought. "No," he said. "I don't think I am." "Then that is something," she said simply. She took his arm as they walked, the way people in those years did in the cold, practical and warm, and he felt the warmth of her through the layers of cloth between them, and felt that he was not, in fact, too far gone to be known by another person. That what he had thought was irrevocable distance was simply the accumulated scar tissue of years that had been survived but not yet healed. January arrived with a cold that was not metaphorical but actual, the kind of cold that killed livestock and caused pipes to burst and made the simple act of riding across open country a significant physical undertaking. Grant spent the first 2 weeks of January doing nothing but ranch work and survival-adjacent tasks, because the cold had decided to be one of those January colds that was not interested in negotiations. But he came back to Millhaven every evening because the alternative was not available to him any more in the way it had once been, the option of simply not caring where he came back to. He and Edith had, by unspoken mutual agreement, moved into the territory of acknowledged feeling. He was not a man who had the language for romantic expression as it was written in novels, and she was not a woman who wanted it, but there were other languages available and they were fluent in them. There was the language of time deliberately given, of evenings spent in companionable conversation about everything and nothing, of a hand held while walking through cold streets, of a look across a supper table that said, "I see you and I am glad you're here," with a completeness that required no other vocabulary. One evening in mid-January, sitting by the fire in Mrs. Pruitt's sitting room after supper with a book she was reading and a letter he was writing to Theodore Holt about spring planning, Edith looked up and said, quite matter-of-factly, "Do you ever think about staying permanently? In Millhaven, I mean." He looked up from the letter. "I have thought about it. And it would depend on whether there was a reason to stay," he said, with the deliberate caution of a man who is saying something careful and wants her to understand that its carefulness is not distance. She looked at him with those hazel eyes that he now knew were particularly gold in firelight. "There might be a reason," she said, with equal deliberateness. "Then I might stay," he said. She smiled and returned to her book, and Grant looked at the letter he was supposed to be writing and could not, for a significant period of time, remember a single thing he had intended to say in it. The response from the territorial school board arrived in the third week of January. A formal hearing had been scheduled for March in Santa Fe, and Edith's petition had been granted standing as an official community objection. She would need to present in person or appoint a representative, and the board would hear arguments on both sides before making a final determination. She told Grant about this on a Tuesday evening with the measured excitement of someone who has learned to be strategic about hope, who lets themselves feel it but keeps it on a leash. "Will you go?" he asked. "I have to," she said. "I can't send a representative to argue for my own school. I know the arguments and I know the community and I know which facts to put in front of them. Santa Fe is 3 days by stage. I know. I will take you," he said. She looked at him. "Grant your work at the Holt Ranch. Holt owes me days. I have not taken a day since September. I will ask him for the week." There was a pause, and in the pause something happened that Grant only understood later, turning it over in his mind on the ride out to the ranch the next morning. She had been about to argue, to tell him she could manage alone, which was true. She was entirely capable of managing alone. But instead of arguing, she simply looked at him, and what she saw in his expression apparently told her something that resolved the argument before it happened. "Thank you," she said. "That would be a very great help." And then in the quiet afterward, as he was looking at the fire and she was back to her book, she said, without looking up, "Grant, would you pass me that pencil?" It was on the side table next to his chair, and she was on the settee across the room. A small thing, the smallest of requests. He picked up the pencil and crossed to her and held it out. "Please," she said, looking up at him with an expression that was warm and simple and completely without agenda. He gave her the pencil. And as he returned to his chair, he felt the words she had said settle into him, felt what it had been like to respond to it, to give her the thing she had asked for because she had asked with the trust that he would want to help her. And the response that came up in him from somewhere he had thought was closed was immediate and complete and real. He had not said please to anyone in 10 years. That word had left him with the other soft things when the world had decided to be harsh. But sitting there that evening with the fire burning and Edith making a note in the margin of her book, he felt the word forming in him again with an unexpectedness that almost made him press his hand to his chest. He was giving something to her that he had not given to anyone in a decade, the willingness to ask and to be asked with the vulnerability of trust. 3 days later, taking his hat from the hook by the door before the morning ride, he paused and said, "Edith." She was in the kitchen, helping Mrs. Prout with the morning dishes, which she sometimes did when she had an extra few minutes before school. "Yes, there is something I have been thinking." She came to the kitchen doorway, a dish towel in her hands. The morning light was the particular gold of a January sun at a low angle, and it was on her face and hair, and she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "I would like to ask you something," he said, and he heard the formality in his voice and knew it was the armor that was still only half removed but was coming off nonetheless. "And I would like to ask it properly." She waited. Her eyes were very steady. "I am not a man who has much to offer in the way of ease," he said. "I am quiet and I have a difficult history, and I have spent a long time building walls that I am only now finding out how to take down. But I would like, if you are willing, to keep taking them down in your company. I would like for this to be something real, between us." He could hear himself clearly, could hear how unpolished it was, how very far from any speech any character in any novel would make, and he thought briefly that she deserved something better said than this. But she was smiling, the full warm smile, and she crossed the few feet between them without hurrying, and she stood close enough that he could see the small ink stain on her right wrist that was always there, the occupational mark of a woman who wrote many important things every day. "I think," she said, "that you have just asked me something very significant with admirable plainness." "I have." "Then I will answer with equal plainness. Yes, this is something real. It has been for some time, as I think we both know." He reached out and took her hand and held it and said, quietly and with complete sincerity, "Please, stay." The word was from somewhere old in him, somewhere he had thought was gone, and she heard what was in it because she heard everything, and she clasped his hand with both of hers and said, "I am staying." They were not given to public displays, either of them, which suited the sensibilities of a small town that was affectionate toward them but held certain expectations about decorum. But from that morning forward, there was no ambiguity in Millhaven about the nature of the understanding between Grant Langston and Edith Abbott. And the town, which had been watching the development with the invested attention of a small community that considers the romantic arrangements of its members to be matters of some general interest, was comprehensively satisfied. The trip to Santa Fe in March was 3 days by stage-coach through country that was just beginning to show the first tentative color of spring, the occasional pale green flush on the slopes where the snow had retreated, the return of birds that had been elsewhere for the cold months. They traveled with another passenger, a quiet merchant named Howard who was going to Santa Fe on business and read a newspaper the entire journey, which made him ideal company. They talked for the whole 3 days, which should not have surprised either of them but still felt remarkable, the way it always feels remarkable when you discover that the person you love is also inexhaustibly interesting, that the well of things to learn about them does not appear to have a bottom. He told her about Missouri summers in full, with the details she was interested in, the specific sounds and smells of the farm he had grown up on, the creek behind the property, the particular creak of the porch boards his father had never gotten around to fixing. She told him about her mother, who had died when Edith was 15, who had been the person in her family who had taken her reading seriously and maintained that intelligence in a woman was a gift and not a problem. "She would have liked you," Edith said on the second day, watching the landscape through the stage window. "She had a very good eye for people." "What would she have seen in me?" Grant asked, genuinely curious. "A man who does what he says and says what he means," Edith said. She valued that above almost everything else. He thought about this for a while and then said, "I have not always done both those things." "I know," she said, "but you do now. That's what matters." The hearing in Santa Fe was on a Thursday morning in the second week of March, in a formal room in the territorial government building with high windows and the slightly theatrical gravity of official proceedings. There were 3 school board members, a recorder, and a representative for the consolidation proposal, who was a mild-mannered bureaucrat from Albuquerque named Mr. Ferris, who presented his arguments with the competent tedium of someone who is doing his job but has no personal investment in the outcome. Edith presented her arguments with the calm authority and precision of someone who has thought about nothing else for 4 months and knows her material better than she knows her own name. She cited the statute. She presented the enrollment figures, the distances, the economic analyses. She presented signed petitions from every family in Millhaven School District. She presented a letter from Theodore Holt and 2 other ranchers in the area attesting to the community's investment in local education. She presented the argument that consolidation in this specific district would produce the effective end of education for 40% of the affected children, and she presented this not as an appeal to sentiment, but as a measurable outcome the board would be accountable for. Grant sat in the gallery and watched her, and felt a pride so complete it was almost reverent. The board deliberated for 2 hours and returned a ruling that the consolidation proposal as applied to the Millhaven district was denied on the grounds of insufficient alternative provision for the affected students, and that Millhaven School would continue to receive its funding allocation, pending a review in 18 months. Edith came out of the chamber and walked to where Grant was standing in the corridor and stopped in front of him with her face doing several things at once, the professional satisfaction and the relief, and underneath both of those something more private and more personal. "We won," she said. "You won," he said, and took both her hands in his. "It was entirely you." She laughed, a real laugh, bright and unrestrained, and the corridor rang with it. and the two clerks at the far end looked over and then looked tactfully away. And Grant Langston held the hands of this woman and thought that the world had more goodness in it than he had believed for a very long time. They ate supper that evening at a proper restaurant in Santa Fe, the kind of place with tablecloths and a waiter and a menu that required reading, a luxury neither of them was accustomed to, but both of them were entirely willing to embrace for one evening. They ate well and talked and drank a glass of wine each, and at some point in the evening Grant reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced a small item he had been carrying for 2 weeks. It was a ring. Simple, plain silver, bought from a jeweler in Santa Fe that afternoon while Edith was freshening up at the hotel, and he had told her he needed to send a telegraph message, which he had also done, to avoid being a complete liar. "I intended to do this with more ceremony," he said. "I do not know how to manufacture ceremony. I know how to mean things." She was looking at the ring and then at him, and her eyes were bright in the candlelight. "Will you marry me?" he said. "Edith, will you do that?" It was not even quite a question. It was said the way he said the things he was most certain of, as a statement of what he believed was real, offered to her to confirm or deny. She looked at him for a long moment with everything she was on her face, without armor, without reserve, completely and wholly herself. "Yes," she said. "Grant Langston, I absolutely will." He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it and then at him, and then she said, "You know this is going to be the talk of Millhaven for a month." "At minimum," he said. "Mrs. Prout will cry. I expect so. Mr. Foss will make a toast that goes on for 17 minutes. I will endure it." She laughed again and reached across the table and took his hand, and the candle between them burned with its small, steady light, and the restaurant went on around them with its pleasant noise, and the two of them were exactly where they were, no further and no different, and it was absolutely enough. They returned to Millhaven on the Sunday of that week, arriving in the late afternoon when the town was in its quiet Sunday mode, the streets mostly empty, the saloon doing modest business, the church letting out its evening service. They arrived together, and there was no one at the stage stop except Sorensen from the feed store, who was there to collect a shipment of seed, and he looked at them and then at the ring on Edith's hand and said nothing but was smiling broadly as he walked away, and they both understood that by Monday morning the entire town would have been informed. By Monday morning the entire town had been informed. Mrs. Prout did cry, exactly as predicted, though she managed to do it while serving breakfast, which gave it a certain heroic multitasking quality. Mr. Foss's toast at the small celebration dinner Mrs. Prout organized for Wednesday evening was precisely 19 minutes, which Edith had underestimated by 2 minutes, and contained several historical references to notable marriages in frontier history that Mr. Foss had apparently stored in his memory for exactly such an occasion. Theodore Holt shook Grant's hand with the feeling of a man whose good judgment in employees had been confirmed by the universe. Holt embraced Edith and told her 3 things in rapid succession: that Grant was one of the best men she had met in 20 years of running a ranch, that Millhaven needed keeping and she was glad someone was doing it, and that she expected to be invited to the wedding no matter when it was held. She was invited. The wedding was in April, when the spring had fully committed to being spring, and the land around Millhaven was showing its best face, the hills greening slowly, the air warm enough in the afternoons to be pleasant in a good coat. The church had a congregation again by this point, a new reverend having arrived from Albuquerque in February, a practical and good-humored man named Reverend Cole, who performed the ceremony with the cheerful gravity of someone who takes the institution seriously, but also takes joy seriously, and sees no contradiction between the two. The whole of Millhaven came. All 300 souls, and some from the ranches outside, and Miguel Reyes, who stood near the back, and afterward told Edith that his children had spoken of nothing else all week. The Prater brothers were there, Dennis and Archie, and Raymond from the Holt Ranch, who did not smile often but smiled at this, and Sheriff Bream, who was more sentimental than his official bearing suggested, and old Mr. Foss, who wept openly and without embarrassment. Edith wore a dress she had made herself from material ordered from Albuquerque, a deep blue that was the color of the sky over New Mexico at the particular hour when the blue is at its most concentrated, just before it begins to deepen toward evening. She had flowers in her hair, wildflowers from the edges of the property, small and hardy, and the color of the season. Grant wore his best clothes, which were not formal by any standard but which were as good as he had, and he had gotten his hair cut at the barber shop on the Monday before, which Edith had noticed and not commented on but had smiled about. He stood at the front of the church and watched her come down the aisle on the arm of a Millhaven merchant named Carver, who had appointed himself her surrogate escort with the enthusiastic benevolence of someone who has been looking for a meaningful role in a significant occasion. And the feeling in Grant's chest was the accumulated warmth of everything the last 6 months had been. All the evenings at the supper table and the walks in cold air and the letters revised, and the hands held by the fire and the word please said, and meant and received, all of it condensed into this single moment. He said his vows with the plain directness of a man who does not have the language of poetry but has something more useful, the genuine intention behind the words, the actual meaning of what he is committing to. She said hers with the quiet precision of someone who does not commit to things lightly and commits to this one with her whole self. Reverend Cole pronounced them married with audible warmth, and the church made the noise that churches make when a thing that was hoped for has finally and completely happened. They moved into the small house at the west end of Millhaven's Main Street that Grant had spent 2 weeks of evenings making livable, repairing the porch steps and repainting the exterior and putting in a proper stove that would actually heat the place in winter. Edith had curtains made and a rug laid, and arranged the bookshelves with the organized affection of someone who has finally been given enough space for all the books she had been moving with her for years in partial sets. The house was small, 2 rooms and a kitchen and a porch that faced west, so the evenings there were lit with the extraordinary copper light of New Mexico sunsets. And it was, in Grant's understanding of the word, the first home he had had since Missouri. Not a place to sleep or board, but a home, a place that held the specific warmth of the 2 people living in it, that smelled of coffee in the mornings and wood smoke in the evenings, and the particular combination of cedar oil and leather from Grant's saddlebags and the ink and paper that followed Edith everywhere. The spring cattle drive went without incident, which was to say it went with exactly the incidents that cattle drives always produce. The inevitable strays and the day of unexpected weather and the old argument between Dennis and Archie Prater that resurfaced twice a year like seasonal weather, but nothing that was not handled by competent people working together, which was the whole art of the thing. The cattle reached market in Albuquerque at the end of May and achieved a good price, and Theodore Holt was satisfied in the deep, unexpressed way of ranchers who have weathered a difficult winter and come out the other side with their operation intact. He offered Grant a permanent position, not just seasonal, a full year's engagement as his ranch manager at a salary that was an acknowledgement of what the past winter had demonstrated about Grant's competence. Grant accepted and rode back to Millhaven with the particular satisfaction of a man who has stopped moving. Edith received the news with a smile that was quiet and complete. "Good," she said. "Now stop worrying about whether you're staying." "I was not worrying," he said. She gave him the private humor look. "Grant, occasionally," he admitted. She put her hand on his face, a direct and tender gesture, and he leaned into it because the part of him that flinched from tenderness was smaller now and getting smaller. That was simply the truth, and the truth required no apology. Summer in Millhaven was golden and long, and Grant discovered that there was a particular quality to life when the fundamental uncertainties have been resolved, and the daily work is good, and the person you come home to is the person you want to come home to, an easiness that was not complacency but contentment, which is a different thing entirely. Contentment knows what it has and is actively glad of it. He spent the days at the ranch and the evenings at home, and the evenings at home were the continuing education in closeness that he had not known he needed. They read, sometimes together and sometimes separately, and talked about what they read and what had happened in the day, and what they thought about various ongoing matters in the territory and in the country at large, which was undergoing its own considerable turbulence in those years. The aftermath of wars and the contested claims of land and people, and the great friction between the expanding white settlement of the West and the peoples who had lived there before, and were being dispossessed with a violence that was sometimes spectacular and always systematic. Edith spoke about this with the particular directness she brought to everything that she believed was important. The Navajo people who had endured the long walk less than 20 years before, the ongoing displacement of Apache bands from the land that had been theirs for generations, the injustice of treaties made and broken with the operational efficiency of machinery that felt nothing for what it crushed. She taught her students about history as it actually was, which occasionally made her the subject of concerned conversations from certain parents who felt that children's history should be primarily encouraging. "History is primarily encouraging," she told one such parent, with polite firmness, "encouraging of the belief that things can and should be different from how they have been, which requires knowing honestly how they have been." Grant loved her for this specifically, among the many specific things he loved her for. Raymond from the Holt Ranch, who had been watching Grant and Edith through the winter and spring with the careful observation of someone accustomed to reading landscape and weather and the small, meaningful signs in things, came to Grant one August morning and said simply, "You are a different man than you were in October." Grant looked at him. Raymond was not a man given to unnecessary speech, so when he spoke it was worth attending to. "Yes," Grant said, "I am. This is a good place," Raymond said. "This territory. It does not require you to be small in it." He meant more than the physical landscape, and Grant understood that he meant more, and he thought about the long years of having been small, having made himself small, the constriction of a life lived entirely without connection or risk, and how the opposite of small was not large but simply open, expanded to the actual size of what was possible. "I know," Grant said. In October, just over a year after he had first ridden into Millhaven, Edith told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the evening in the kitchen, where she had been standing at the window looking at something in the backyard, with an expression he had walked in on and could not immediately read. She turned when she heard him and said, with the same directness she had always used for every important thing, "I am pregnant. I believe sometime in the spring." He crossed the kitchen and took her in his arms, and she came against him, and they stood there for a moment in the evening kitchen, and he felt the world expand again, which he had not thought it could do further, but apparently it could. Apparently it was willing to keep doing this, keep showing him that the dimensions of good things were larger than he had managed to conceive. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "Somewhat," she said honestly. "Are you?" "Somewhat," he said. "Mostly glad." "Mostly glad is right," she agreed, and he felt her smile against his shoulder. The 18-month review of Millhaven School's funding came through in the late autumn, and the result was a full continuation of the allocation and a small increase for facility improvement, which Edith credited to the petition work and the hearing record, and also to the fact that the new territorial superintendent had a daughter of school age and took educational access personally. She used the facility improvement funding to repair the schoolroom's floor, which had developed a troublesome creak near the stove that she described as distracting to students during examinations, and to purchase 12 new textbooks and a proper world map, a large one printed in color on good paper, which she hung on the wall where the children could see it during every lesson, and which became the source of daily questions about the places on it that they had not yet learned about. Grant built her a proper bookshelf for the schoolroom, out of the good pine that Harlow's mercantile had started carrying, since the lumber supply from the north had improved. He built it over 2 evenings after the ranch work was done, measuring it to fit the exact dimensions of the available wall space, and she watched him work with the particular attention she gave to things she valued. And when he set the last shelf in place and it was solid and true and exactly the right size, she ran her hand along the length of it and looked at him with something in her expression that was past words. "It's perfect," she said. "Please tell me when it's not," he said, and the ease with which the word came out now still surprised him sometimes, still felt like a small and recurring miracle, the please that had come back to life in him. She looked at him with full understanding of what he had said and what was behind it. "I always will," she said. Their son was born in the first week of April 1884, at the beginning of the spring that smelled of new grass and wet earth and the particular sweetness of a season that has been waited for. Doc Whitmore attended, calm and competent, and Mrs. Prout was there because she had appointed herself to that role, and no one had thought to argue against it. And Grant was there through all of it, present in the way he was present to everything that mattered now, completely and without reservation. The boy was born at 3 in the morning and was immediately and comprehensively himself, with a full head of dark hair and eyes that were still the undecided blue of all newborns, but which, in the weeks following, would resolve into a clear hazel that was unmistakably his mother's. They named him James Robert Langston. James for Grant's father, Robert for no reason other than that it was a solid name and suited him. Grant held him in the gray early morning light while Edith slept, exhausted and complete, and he looked at this new person who had not existed 4 hours ago, and was now entirely real and entirely present in his. And he felt the accumulated distance of 10 solitary years, and the equally accumulated closeness of the 2 years since he had ridden into Millhaven close and present at the same time, like 2 landscapes occupying the same space. And he understood clearly, and with the full authority of genuine comprehension, that he was not the person he had been, not erased, not as though the hard years had not happened, but changed in the way that things are changed by genuine transformation, which keeps the original material but does something new and true with it. He was a man who asked for things now, and meant the asking, and received what was offered, and gave what was asked of him, and said please and thank you and I love you with the certainty of someone for whom these words are not performance, but the plain, ordinary, faithful language of the life he was actually living. In the summer of 1884, there was a drought that made the range work difficult and extended, and physically exhausting, in the way that heat and dry conditions make everything harder. And there were arguments at the county level about water rights that Grant navigated with the patience and legal literacy that Edith had, in the way she had, expanded in him, his understanding that the language of institutions was a thing that could be learned and used rather than simply submitted to. In the autumn, Edith went back to school with James on her hip for the first week while they worked out the childcare arrangement, which ultimately involved Mrs. Prout, who was delighted to have a purpose and a baby in roughly equal measure, and the schoolroom had a small chair set up in the corner for James's visits, because the children of Millhaven had collectively decided he was the school's unofficial mascot, and were collectively affronted on the days he did not appear. Theodore Holt retired at the end of 1884, formally, and with the relief of a man whose body has been telling him to stop for some time. He offered Grant the option of purchasing the ranch on a payment arrangement that was fair and structured to be genuinely achievable. Grant and Edith discussed it for a week, sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings with the lamp between them and James asleep in the other room, going through the figures and the projections and the practical realities of what it meant to own rather than manage. "It's a good ranch," Edith said on the 3rd evening of the discussion. "It is," Grant agreed. "And you know it better than any place you've known since Missouri. Better than Missouri, even. I was young in Missouri. Can we afford it?" "With 3 years of careful management, yes. The 4th year is where we have margin." "Then we should do it," she said, with the clean decisiveness of someone who has thought through the relevant considerations and arrived at a conclusion. "It is a good thing to own the land you work." He looked at her across the lamp with the feeling that had been his for 2 years now and had not diminished a degree, if anything had increased, the ongoing specific astonishment of being known and choosing and being chosen. "When you came to Millhaven," he said, "were you looking for this?" She tilted her head slightly, the way she did when considering something carefully. "I was looking for a life that fit," she said. "I knew the shape of what I needed better than I knew where to find it. A place where my work was useful and real, people worth knowing, something to build." She paused. "I was not specifically looking for you, but I found you and you fit the shape exactly." He reached across the table and she took his hand. Outside the house, the New Mexico night was enormous and starred, and the land all around was the land they were going to own, that they were already tending, that had already begun to hold the shape of their lives together. "You fit mine," he said. "Exactly." They bought the Holt Ranch in January 1885, and the papers were signed in the county office in the presence of Theodore and Mee Holt, who were moving to their daughter's home in Colorado, and who gave Grant and Edith a hand-drawn map of every spring and water source on the property as their parting gift, which was the most practical and valuable thing they could have given and was therefore exactly right. Mee hugged Edith for a long time and then stepped back and held her by the shoulders and said, "You took good care of him, the man and the land both." "He took equally good care of me," Edith said. "Good," Mee said firmly. "That's how it ought to work." The ranch was theirs by spring. The cattle drive that year was the first that Grant managed as owner rather than employee, and the difference in how it felt was measurable and real, and not something he could have explained to someone who had not known both sides of it. Raymond stayed on, as he had told Grant he would if the ownership changed hands in this direction, and the Prater brothers stayed, and 2 new hands were hired, a quiet, efficient man from Texas named Colby, and a young Mexican-American man from Albuquerque named Felipe, who was 19, and had more natural skill with horses than anyone Grant had seen since he himself was that age. The school's 18-month review process came again in the spring of 1885, and again, the result was continuation, and this time, a more substantial facility improvement allocation, enough to finally address the roof that had been a source of concern since the previous winter, and to add a second room to the building which would allow Edith to separate the youngest students from the older ones for part of the day, a change she had been working toward for years. Grant and 3 volunteers from the community, including Sorensen and Miguel Reyes, and a carpenter named Webb who had moved to Millhaven the previous autumn, built the addition over 4 Saturdays in May, and it was done before the summer ended the school year, and was ready for the new term in September. That second school year in the larger building, Edith had 17 students, and the teaching aide who helped with the younger group in the afternoons was a young woman named Clara Reyes, Miguel's eldest daughter, who was 18 and had been Edith's best student and who, under Edith's encouragement and advocacy, was pursuing her own certification. James Langston was a year and a half and had strong opinions about everything, which surprised no one who knew his parents. He had Grant's dark hair and Edith's hazel eyes, and a disposition that combined Grant's directness with Edith's sociability in a mixture that was both charming and occasionally exhausting. He had also begun the process of learning to walk with the single-minded determination of someone who has decided this is a skill worth having and intends to have it. On an October evening in 1885, precisely 3 years after Grant had first ridden into Millhaven on a gray morning with the dust rising behind him, he and Edith sat on the porch of the ranch house with the evening light doing its best work on the land, the sky going from gold to copper to the deep concentrated blue that preceded the stars, and James was asleep inside, and the cattle were in the south pasture, and the horses were in the barn, and everything was where it was supposed to be. Edith had a letter in her lap that she had been reading from the Territorial Education Department, a request that she consider applying for a position on the regional school board, a new advisory body being established to help coordinate educational policy in the Southeastern Territories. "Will you?" Grant asked. "I think I will," she said. "It's a way to extend what we did here from Millhaven to other places with the same problems. You would be very good at it." "I would be relentless at it," she said, with the private humor that was one of the permanent treasures of his life. "That is the same thing," he said. She laughed and leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they sat looking at the land in the evening light. Their land. The land that was going to grow the life they were building with the patience and certainty of something that has good ground under it. He had ridden into Millhaven 10 years, into a decade of silence and distance, 10 years of yes and no, and take what is needed and give nothing that costs anything. 10 years of the careful desolation of a man who has decided that the safest thing is to need nothing. He had not asked, and he had not been asked, and the word please had lived nowhere in him, neither spoken nor felt, because please requires the belief that what you are asking for might actually be given, and he had stopped believing that. She had asked him for a pencil, the smallest of things, and he had given it to her and meant the giving and felt in the giving the first movement of something returning to life that he had believed was gone. And she had said thank you and looked at him the way she looked at him, with the clean, full attention that received everything, and the thing that had been returning to life had kept on coming. Now he sat with her on the porch of their ranch in the dying October light, and felt the specific and enormous smallness of the life they had. Small in the good sense, in the sense of being exact and particular and real, fitted to the precise dimensions of who they were and what they needed, and what they had made together in this unlikely place in the middle of the vast and difficult and beautiful country of the New Mexico Territory. He pressed his lips to her hair and said quietly against the warmth of it, "Thank you for asking." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Thank you for answering." Above them the first stars were coming out over the high country, indifferent and brilliant. The same stars that had been there before any of this and would be there after. The same stars under which 10,000 other stories in the West were being made and unmade and remade. But there was only this one, only this porch and this woman and this man who had come back from the far country of his own isolation, and found, in a small town at the edge of a territory still learning what it was. The particular homecoming that no map can show you and no road runs toward, but that is nevertheless, when you arrive at it, unmistakable. The evening settled around them. The cattle were quiet in the south pasture. James turned in his sleep in the warm house behind them. The land held the last of the light as long as it could, the way land does when the day has been good. And Grant Langston, who had not said please to anyone in a decade, who had kept himself at a careful and complete distance from everything that might cost him something, sat with his wife on the porch of their ranch, and felt the full, uncomplicated weight of a life that had been found rather than constructed. Had come to him not through merit but through the grace of a woman who had passed him a cup of coffee on a Tuesday morning, and told him where the barber was and where the doctor was, and had done it not because he was remarkable but because he was there and he was human. And she had decided long ago that the most useful thing you could do with your own aliveness was extend it toward other people's. He had extended it back. That was all. He had stopped holding it away from her and he had extended it back, and that had been the whole of it, and the whole of it was everything. The stars came fully out. The night settled in with its cold and its silence and its vast starred ceiling. Edith pulled the blanket from the back of the porch chair around her shoulders and leaned against him and was warm and present and entirely herself. And Grant Langston held her and was, completely and without reservation, home. In the months and years that followed, the ranch grew steadily into the operation Grant had always known it could be, with the north pasture fully reclaimed, and a new water system that Raymond had helped engineer, making the summer range more reliable than it had been in Holt's time. Felipe turned out to have not just a gift with horses, but a talent for the business end of things. And Grant began bringing him into the seasonal planning discussions, with the intention of eventually giving him more formal management responsibility. Colby stayed on and became in time the kind of hand that every operation needs, the person who has been there long enough to know where everything is and how everything works and who can be trusted absolutely. The school continued and grew. Clara Reyes received her teaching certification in the spring of 1886 and joined Edith formally, which freed Edith to take on the regional board work that she had begun the previous autumn, traveling to Santa Fe twice a year for the board meetings and corresponding by letter in between with the other members, and producing the kind of clear, data-supported arguments for rural educational funding that, over the subsequent years, would materially change the allocation of resources for a dozen small schools in the Southeastern Territory. She was called by a reporter from the Albuquerque paper who came out in 1887 to write about the region's schools, the most effective advocate for rural education in the territory, and the description pleased her in the way that accurate descriptions of things you have worked for always please, not with vanity, but with the satisfaction of being seen correctly. James Langston grew from a strong-willed toddler into a strong-willed boy who had his mother's gifts with language and his father's gifts with the land and animals, and who combined these inheritances in the way of children who are fortunate enough to have two parents worth learning from, selectively, and with the intelligence of someone who knows what he is reaching for. In the spring of 1887, Edith told Grant she was expecting again, with the same directness and the same morning kitchen light and a different expression, more certain this time, more settled in the knowing of what was coming. Their second child was a boy as well. They named him Thomas William Langston, Thomas for an uncle of Edith's who had been kind to her, and William because Grant thought it suited him, and he arrived in November of 1887, with the red face and strong lungs of a person who intends to make his presence known. James took to his brother with the proprietorial enthusiasm of a 4-year-old who has been told a very important thing is coming and has been waiting impatiently for its arrival. And the ranch house, which had been full of the warmth of two people and their particular life, became full of the larger and louder warmth of a family, of small feet on the floorboards and small voices asking the enormous questions that small people ask, and the ongoing daily project of raising human beings, which is the longest and most important work either of them did. On a Sunday evening in December of 1887, with both boys asleep and the house quiet and the fire burning in the good stove that Grant had installed 2 years before, they sat together in the sitting room with the lamps low and the sound of the wind against the windows and the simple solid fact of each other's presence, and Edith looked at the fire and said quietly, "Do you remember the first morning, in Mrs. Pruitt's dining room?" "Yes," he said. "You sat down across from me and drank your coffee and did not say a word. You had said everything necessary." She smiled at the fire. "I was showing off slightly. I do that when I am unsure of something." He looked at her, genuinely surprised. "You were unsure. You were a stranger, a very quiet one. I did not know what you were. And now," she turned to look at him with the eyes he had learned by heart over 5 years, the hazel that went gold in firelight, the directness and warmth that had been there from the beginning and had not changed or diminished. "Now I know exactly what you are," she said. "What am I?" She considered it with the serious attention she gave to things she wanted to say accurately. "You are a good man who was lost for a while and came back," she said. "And you came back all the way. That is not a small thing." He looked at her for a long moment. "Neither are you," he said. She took his hand and he held it, and the fire burned, and the wind moved outside, and the boys slept, and the land was quiet under the December stars. And the whole of the life they had made together was right where it was, solid and warm and real, built from the small and the particular and the genuine, from a cup of coffee on a Tuesday and a pencil passed across a room and a word said, and meant that had not been said in 10 years, and meant something different now than it had ever meant before. Meant the opening of a door that had been shut a long time and was now standing wide. Please, stay, I am staying. That was the whole of it, and the whole of it was enough, and the whole of it was more than enough, and the fire went on burning, and the stars went on burning, and the land held them as land holds everything it has been trusted with the patient and indifferent and entirely adequate permanence of ground.